Good day, everybody, and welcome to yet another episode of the Constitution at Work podcast, brought to you by the F.W. de Klerk Foundation, dedicated to making our constitutional democracy a reality for all South Africans. Today, our podcast delves into South Africa's economy through the lens of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and will explore legal, economic, and social intersections. I'm delighted to introduce our guests today. Our first guest, Professor Haroon Bhorat, is a distinguished economist and the director of the Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town. His extensive research has profoundly influenced our understanding of labor economics, poverty, and income distribution, particularly in South Africa and across Africa. Our professor holds a PhD in economics. He's made significant contributions to both academic research and public policy. He serves on the South African Presidential Economic Advisory Council and has advised multiple South African presidents on economic matters, including his impactful work on the National Minimum Wage Commission. His work seamlessly bridges rigorous empirical analysis with policy advice. I also have with me today Pieter Scribante. Now, Pieter is a senior political economist at Oxford Economics Africa with over 5 years of experience as an economist, a political analyst, and a researcher. And Pieter holds an MSc in Political Sciences and Political Economy from the London School of Economics and a Master's in Commerce in Economics from the University of Pretoria. Welcome to you all. And
thank you.
To begin our conversation, I would like to explore each of your perspectives on the current state of the South African economy, considering both global economic trends and domestic challenges, but I think I'd like to kick off with domestic challenges. Professor Bhorat, with your extensive research in labor economics, how do you assess the current economic climate in South Africa? What do you see as the most pressing issues impacting labor markets? And here I must note that data shows that South Africa's unemployment rate has risen to 32.9%, with over 8.4 million people unemployed, and income inequality placing South Africa as one of the most unequal societies in the world. How do you think these challenges intersect domestically?
Thanks very much. I mean, I think, so it's a big question. So just to keep in mind, it's useful to think of growth in terms of long and short run determinants, right? So in the long run, so since 94, we've been in a long run middle income country growth trap, right? So that's just a very long-winded way of saying that our growth rates are far too low relative to our emerging market peers. So we've been growing at about 2% per year every year for, you can take a pick, you can take 30 years or you can take 40 years, pre-apartheid or post-apartheid. That compares to a China, which grows at not 2% a year for 30 years, but 8% a year for 30 years, and less well-known, Vietnam, growing at about 5-6%. So the long-run growth malaise is the first challenge you have to think about. But if you overlay that with what I call the more immediate short-run effects that have reinforced our low growth trajectory, which is state capture and the collapse of infrastructure, which is very well covered in the media. And that's everything from energy to water and so on, rail, roads, ports. All of that has reinforced an already low, structurally defined and determined growth trajectory. So in other words, even if you take away those, so in fact, let's put it differently, if you take away those short-term structural constraints, right, around state capture determined constraints, our growth rate wouldn't even breach 4%, for example, on average. So we struggle with, and you ask the question, well, what explains it and what are its features? The one key feature in the long run is a pattern of deindustrialization or premature deindustrialization. And so the idea that we've got a manufacturing sector that's far too small, that in fact is shedding jobs rather than gaining jobs. And in most of the successful East Asian economies, from China right back to Japan, and in fact right back to the Great Industrial Revolution, manufacturing was front and center in terms of low wage growth, which is low wage employment, which is where you want to see jobs being generated. There's a little bit of a debate about the role of services. So let me just quickly then add on and then I'll stop. But I do think it's really important not to sort of bash out the same story. We know the premature deindustrialization story, and I think that's a key aspect of structural transformation, and how you're going to create jobs is about manufacturing and a little bit of medium skilled services like BPOs and so on. But actually so the lecture you mentioned at the outset is really important. That it's something that I've been grappling with for 30 years trying to do this, which is it doesn't make sense that we have such a high unemployment rate. And I want the listeners to understand where this comes from. We have the highest unemployment rate in the world, but yet, and this is the key smoking gun, the output employment elasticity for South Africa, the conversion from growth to employment, is about the same as most of Latin America and other emerging markets. 1% growth, right, generates about a 0.6% increase in employment. That's not unusually bad. So why do we have such high unemployment rates? These economies are not better than us at creating jobs from growth. And even if you double our growth rate to 5 or 10%, you don't generate the kinds of numbers of jobs that you need to. So what do these other economies do? Well, guess what? They have millions upon millions of people in the informal sector. The average emerging market has, for every 100 people, 45 people are in the informal sector, 45 in wage employment, 45 in the informal sector, and 10 in unemployment. 45, 45, 10. South Africa's number is 50. So we actually have more people in wage employment than the average emerging market. But the second number is the problem. We only have 16 out of 100 people in the informal sector, and so those people end up in unemployment. And so the smoking gun you're looking for is that actually our inordinately high unemployment levels are, yes, to do with growth in part, but actually in the main have to do with an informal sector that's not doing its job. It's far too small. And we can talk about why. But that's sort of, for me, where I think the current debates need to move in a slightly different direction from the past.
Yeah. And that's a very interesting analysis of it, Prof. Now, taking that, like, for example, considering the domestic struggles we might find our economy facing, I want to move to discussing in the same lens with Pieter, how the global markets have an effect on South Africa's economy. So Pieter, with your experience or your expertise as a senior political economist and your research on the effects of international economic integration, which provides a very unique viewpoint, how do you interpret the current state of South Africa's economy within the context of the global economy and global economic shifts? And with this, do you believe there are key factors driving our economic performance? And how could South Africa navigate certain challenges posed from shifts in the global economy?
Thank you. Yeah, as the professor said, like, it's a very big question. Unfortunately, South Africa is, like other emerging markets and African countries, susceptible to the global headwinds. So what happens internationally, like, we can't escape it. Currently, I know a lot of people talk about the rand appreciating over the past week, but that has mostly been due to US job numbers and expectations of interest rates. So even though the government of national unity came into full force, which should increase optimism and so forth, that had less of an impact than expectations of US interest rates. So just to give you a broader sense of it. Furthermore, since the end of the period that of low interest rates and essentially a lot of free money, which ended now with the global recession, the Great Global Recession 2008 and 9 as well, there have been less money flowing into high risk countries, emerging market economies, and South Africa as well. But specifically because we don't grow as fast as, let's say, a Tanzania or a Kenya, other African countries, these markets are seen as more favorable than South Africa. In fact, just to color in some of the things that the professor mentioned was that, yes, our growth was roughly 2% over the past 30 years, but over the past 10 years, it was less than 1%. So over the past 10 years, our population expanded by roughly 1.2%, whereas our economy grew by 0.8%. Now, this is a massive mismatch, both in terms of our economy not growing to absorb the amount of people, but also the average South African becoming poorer. And this creates a vicious cycle from the government point of view, because the economy isn't growing, but the population is growing too fast as well. They have less tax revenues to help support businesses and these individuals through grants and so forth. So just to color in that picture. And then from a global integration standpoint, if we look at African economies and the way that they're structured, a lot of the times they're in direct competition with each other. So for instance, if in Ivory Coast and in Ghana, for instance, they both export a lot of cocoa. Actually, I think with Nigeria included, they export 70% of the world's cocoa. So this does not really allow for integration into regional economies like you'd see in Europe. In Europe, you can have things being produced on secondary stage in Eastern Europe, and that would go to Germany, and that create value, especially since they're so close. This value compounds in growth and benefits. Whereas in Africa, we do not see this regional integration, solely because we export, even in South Africa, which we can argue is the most developed in Africa, again, depending on the metrics you look at, but we still export so many unprocessed raw materials. We export these overseas and re-import the refined and processed materials, which is it's connected to the deindustrialization of South Africa. But we export, again, the cheaper part of it, and then the value gets added overseas. And this is the story in a lot of African countries. And I truly believe that increased regional integration, if we can get the supply chains to work together, that there's a lot of value to be added. But again, this is a very easier said than done, but it is a potential avenue that other continents do, but Africa doesn't do it enough.
Pieter, I'm so glad that you touched on supply and production and so well compared our position in South Africa to other countries around the globe, because I have a follow-up question for you. And what we've been doing at the FW de Klerk Foundation is focusing on the economy, yes, but also focusing on the Constitution and the constitutional provisions in the Bill of Rights that give effect to people's right to, for instance, dignity. Having a job means you have more dignity, or the right to economic participation. And in light of the right to dignity and in light of the right to constitutional, or rather economic participation, how do you see the role of job creation, particularly from the lens of the green economy, in enhancing this right? So we know that the president has just recently signed into law the Climate Change Act. How do you think sectors in society, like for example, the agricultural sector and rural development programs, can use this shift towards green energy and climate change initiatives, which have been a big talking point overseas, to address the economic challenges and improve job opportunities back home?
Several, again, layers to that question, but very excellent questions. In general, on the first part of it, job creation versus personal dignity is an absolute true connection, because having a job gives you the opportunity to decide on your future and your children's future, where you want to stay, where you want to go, what you want to do, having that financial stability. Whereas not having a job, so remaining in the small area of the world, of the country where you were born and your parents were born, despite whatever choices you want to make, it's a form of a trap, unfortunately. The green economy, I do think I might have semi mixed opinions with regards to the true impact of it. I'm a big proponent of it, and I do think there's a lot of potential, and more than that, a big need. But the question is still, from a development point of view, what we can develop here in South Africa. If we think about EV technologies, and specifically making cheaper solar panels and so forth, which is a very industrializing aspect, China is leaps and bounds ahead of us. And the European Union is also investing a lot of money to improve this sector, and the same in the US as well, but we aren't committing money to it. I honestly, I haven't seen any studies done on it. I don't know if we committing money to developing a green industry in South Africa, I mean, trying to be a globally competitive green industry, if it will actually work. It's a lot of highly educated skills that are needed, but from not top end necessarily, but from the middle end, making small changes on the margins, including our agricultural, especially with climate variability and the raining seasons that are both way too excessive and then not enough. Implementing these practices and developing new ones as well, that's absolutely key. It's just where we slot into this picture that is a bit uncertain at the moment, but there is definitely opportunity for South Africa to grab and to benefit.
Now, taking that into account, I just wanted to ask Prof Bhorat and yourself, Pieter. We could probably start with Prof Bhorat. Discussing the issue of triple BEE. Now, we've been looking into it as the foundation. We've been looking at, the benefits and, the constraints of triple BEE. And I want us to discuss, touching base on the domestic implications and effects of triple BEE to the international effect. Pieter, you spoke about favorability. And I just want us to discuss, because given the Constitution's focus on equality and fairness enshrined in Section 9, we see how triple BEE, we want to analyze how triple BEE is effective in achieving these constitutional goals. So would you propose changes to triple BEE to promote maybe more economic inclusion? We know that there's some political parties, that oppose triple BEE, because sometimes they see it as expanding this notion of inequality within the country. Now, we also see triple BEE policies coming under some heavy criticism from the international community, because companies don't really want to invest in South Africa because of these policies. Now, what are your takes on it? We can start from Professor Bhorat and then move on to
yeah.
Pieter.
So look, Ezra. I mean, the way to think about this, and I haven't done any research in the area, right? So this is not something that I can point to certainly clear empirical evidence, which, as far as I'm aware of, hasn't been done. So let's just be very clear about that, right? So I think any of the listeners, and I'm sure Pieter would agree, that you have to start from first principles and ask the question, well, what is the evidence about the impact of triple BEE, right? So with that in mind, here's a couple of things to think about. Firstly, what is the counterfactual? The counterfactual is a 94 agreement that excludes any formal empowerment legislation or regulations that enforce the involvement and the active participation of Black people in the economy. I think if you didn't have that, I think we'd be in a very different space and a place as a country. So that's the first thing, right? So the counterfactual is no triple BEE. Well, that's a scary place in 94, right? The second is it about the policy or is it about the application of the policy? And this gets into the whole enrichment versus empowerment debate, right? So there again, right? Is it the fact that you had rules that were designed, say, in supply chains to give access to contracts for Black people? Or is it the fact that the contracts went to the same people and too many to the same people? Or to people who were connected, right? Or to people who were known to a certain party and so on. So is it more about enrichment rather than empowerment? The third is almost certainly contestable. I can tell you now, empirically, is about inequality. I mean, I'd be very surprised if you can point to triple BEE as a serious determinant of rising inequality in South Africa. I mean, I'd be, it's got far more to do with the structural features I spoke about earlier, right? The lack of jobs growth, stubbornly high unemployment rates, all sorts of other things. That being said, and then the fourth one, and I'll come to sort of, this is more playing devil's advocate. The fourth one is FDI and the view from foreign direct investors that BEE is a key deterrent. it's also true that there are a series of other factors, right? So during the Zuma years, it was about state capture. I mean, that's the reason foreign investors stayed away. They knew the BEE rules are actually quite clear, right? And so as long as it's a cost that's borne equally by all competitors, why should you care as a foreign direct investor, right? It's not that it's a particularly onerous cost for foreign investors rather than domestic investors. So that's the way to think about it. But that being said, there are very clear structural features that did come out of the Zuma era around certain sectors, like in mining, where because of the rule changes, once empowered, always empowered sort of concern, there is at least informal evidence to suggest that the rules need to be reimagined, reconsidered, or at least the application needs to be much clearer. So I think that's a much better starting point, which is, the framework with a counterfactual that doesn't have BBBEE doesn't make sense, right? So is it about tweaking it? Is it about avoiding enrichment? And there are rules, right? The Malaysians have done that, right, for local Malays versus the Chinese. So it's not unusual, right? But it's about how you design something rather than saying, okay, well, this is it, it's not working.
And Pieter, your take on
Yeah,
that?
it's a very complex. I honestly think that during the apartheid years, the government they were basically doing white economic empowerment to the extreme, and the use of BEE or triple BEE now to correct it, especially after 94 and in the initial years, it's essential. And again, I do agree with the professor with regarding to how you measure this. I'm just trying to think of an empirical study, how you would be able to do it. And it's extremely tricky, especially removing it from the other factors influencing the country. So if we think about the first 15 years up until and including Mbeki, the economy was booming. It was above 4%. Unemployment was declining. If you would have stopped the data there, you would have said the reforms and BE or whatever, that point is doing well. And then afterwards, it's doing poorly. And I do think that it has to do broadly again with, as the professor said, with state capture and the implementation of it. I know my mother worked for the private sector, in public sector and private sector, but when she was working in government at one point, every tender they had to give out, basically, she knew by the length of the document that she got back whether this person would get the contract or not. And what she explained was that they had to tick so many boxes that in the end there would be a document this thick for delivering coffee and tea, because they got every single BEE requirement done. And then it's like, but if a company would be like, oh, I know exactly how to get you cheap coffee and tea, I'm very close to your government buildings, we can do this, whatever, but they can't write the formal document in every single way, like it just makes it impossible. And by the end, the people that get the job through, especially BE government contracts and so forth, are the ones that just know how to play the game, not the ones that would be the best for Black economic empowerment, for economic growth, for growing a thriving private sector. So this system has, as well-intentioned as it has been, I think at this point, I don't know how effective it is and to what extent it actually could be excluding businesses, not just because of the businesses isn't necessarily transformed. That is definitely an issue that needs to be addressed, but simply because it creates such bureaucratic rules on companies that it just becomes inefficient, and having to dedicate so much resources to ensuring that all these steps are followed. I do think that's extremely detrimental to domestic and international companies. Again, if there's a dollar to be made, companies will pursue it. But at this point, I do think our private sector needs to be empowered to a greater extent to help alleviate our unemployment crisis.
And I'm very glad that you both touched on other factors as well that contribute to the lack of efficacy in the economy, like state capture and so forth. And I think what we've been looking at the F.W. de Klerk Foundation is, yes, looking at the law itself, as I mentioned, looking at whether it's pertinently in line with the Constitution, whether it achieves its noble aim of substantive equality, or whether it's a law that's acceptable but flawed in implementation. But I think the next question that I have for the both of you touches a little bit less on the law itself and more on execution, and specifically in terms of the budget. Now, Pieter, Professor Bhorat, you guys have been looking at the budget speeches in Parliament. We've seen increased spending on state infrastructure, support for state-owned enterprises. In fact, we even now have claims of a super state-owned enterprise that will be consuming what was the Department of Public Enterprises. And the question that I have for the both of you is, do you believe that these changes will address our economic challenges effectively? Now, Professor Bhorat, I know that you mentioned our slow GDP growth. We stand at 0.5% or so per annum. We have issues like power shortages impacting sectors like agriculture. Now, what further budget changes or changes in the priority of the budget do you think are necessary to support our economic recovery going forward?
Yeah, again, a massive question. There's probably about 4 PhDs in that question. So let's start. I mean, so the problem has been post-state capture is a massive and significant increase in debt to GDP ratios, right? So you do see it in the MTF, in the medium-term expenditure framework, and Treasury has been, let's call it, reclaimed from the Zuma era, and so it's back. We're back in safe hands. We look like we did under the Mbeki era, with a strong executive team in National Treasury, a strong Minister of Finance. And so the idea now with the MTF is, how do you moderate any increases in the debt to GDP ratio? How do you pay off loans that are due? All the good things about fiscal management of the deficit. So that's in place. But what we've been delivered as a key consequence of state capture is this large debt problem, which means that there's very little wiggle room for the state and for government to increase real values of allocations to, you name it, whether it's housing, whether it's state-owned enterprises, and so on, right? So what you end up with is effectively so you have two choices really as the state. Either you get higher growth rates, which is going to increase revenue, and then you've got something in the coffers to actually finance growth and crowd in investment. Or the second thing you can do, which I think is completely underappreciated, and this is the second order challenge for government, is to improve the efficiency of spending. That's what you really have to do, actually. So, and in fact, it's true, if you look at efficiency frontiers for things like schooling and a whole series of other government outputs, whether it's crime fighting through police services and so on. So let's take education. We spend about the same as a bunch of other emerging markets as a share of GDP on education. But the returns, and you can take standardized test scores as one example, international standardized test scores, the returns are much lower for South Africa relative to the other countries who spend the same amount. What does it mean? There's wastage. Either it's too high wages, unions that are too strong in the education sector, for example, that have set wages either way too high or not heterogeneous relative to the scarce skills of the teacher. So a physics teacher gets the same wage as a history teacher, with due respect, right? So that's the kind of challenge you have in the schooling system. And it's also just not enough productivity, as we call it, of teachers, right? So absenteeism rates are really high and so on. You can see that operating across all areas of government, whether it's crime fighting, whether it's housing, and so on, where for the same rand that, or let's say same dollar that we spend of the fiscus on those social services, the returns we get relative to other emerging markets is too low. So it's not really, I don't think, about more money, at least in the short run, right? It's really about spending better and spending more efficiently. And I think that's a big challenge for government going forward.
Pieter?
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the biggest impacts is currently, and especially over the past couple of years, we've done a lot of debt-driven consumption spending. So basically, the rule of thumb when you get to incurring more debts, like government incur more debt, and that could be a very good thing if you want to fund big infrastructure projects or something that structurally improves the economy that leads to higher growth. This is why every government has debt. However, it's what you use the debt for in the end. And especially under the Zuma years, this is horrendous in terms of how much our debt to GDP ratio increased. But even if we think about just before the election and the national budget in February, the only spending that increased was on wages, and we had to incur more debts to pay that. So that's a solid example of debt-driven short-term consumption spending. So technically, the government is literally borrowing from future generations to fund salaries right now. And again, if they use this money to build big schools or whatever, fix our infrastructure, our economy will grow in such a fashion that it'll be easy to repay these. Actually, the returns will be higher, but there are no returns when you just increase some salaries. Our state-owned enterprises, I know over the past decade or more, has captured such an extraordinary amount of the budget, and it's just throwing money into a sinkhole, unfortunately. I do think the problems have had enough attention, especially the fact that our lights continue to be on, which is fantastic, and also bare necessity. It is a good thing, but we've been saddled with a lot of problems with regarding to that. And I do think it's still state-owned enterprises are a strategic weakness in South Africa, where it can be a massive asset. And in general, our budget isn't exorbitant. It isn't crazy in terms of our VAT or taxes. It could, of course, be lower. I would like that as well, but it isn't into the magnitude I've seen overseas. So there are a lot of sound budgeting principles applied, and I've met a lot of people working in the National Treasury and so forth, and they are really great economists. I have a lot of faith in them. But if the overall bureaucracy isn't working, then that is a massive problem. Just to give some facts, I remember researching this a while back, but if you look at school attendance rates of teachers in all the Model C schools, which are more classically white and apartheid empowered and all those things, the average teacher would attend school between, I think, 5.8 hours to 6 hours, basically a school day. Whereas in other schools, more rural and disadvantaged schools, teachers average about 4 hours a day. And it's horrific in terms of not just correcting the past injustices, but we can't fire these teachers just over strong unions, still getting high salaries, and so many thousands of teachers being put on paid administrative leave, and they just get their salaries without having to pitch up to school. It is extremely frustrating and horrendous. And this is why the education department grabs such a large share of the budget, but isn't delivering. I mean, the results are increasing as far as I have it, but it's still horrific if we look at a number of students that enter grade 1 and eventually finish matric. Those figures are dismal, and by their nature take years to correct. And it's still very, very worrying.
So speaking on delivery and the increased spending, especially on high salaries, I wanted to ask you, Professor Bhorat, that given the significant disparity between the salaries of South African politicians and the average South African citizen, and considering your insights from your well-articulated webinar on measuring the returns on investment, do you believe South Africa is getting a fair return on investment for the high salaries paid to its public officials? And if not, what metrics would you suggest or recommend we could use to assess this return on investment?
Yeah, so again, it's really hard to compare in sort of US dollar PPP terms, unit wage levels of, let's say, a median public sector worker relative to that in an emerging market, because the data is really poor. So that's your starting point, right? So you don't want to, again, extract from our public sector wage levels, not wage bill, that they're way higher than, nobody can tell you that with certainty. And I'm not interested in advanced countries. We have to look at emerging markets, right? So that's the first challenge. And again, it comes to, in a low inequality society like India or in much of South Asia, public sector wages are probably going to be lower because it's a low inequality society, right? But a teacher is a highly skilled person in an emerging market context. And in our context, they tend to be right at the top of the distribution. It's that kind of strangeness, right? Because we are a high inequality society. So the real challenge actually is around the wage bill. So that's your problem, right? So, and I think that was alluded to earlier by Pieter, that effectively you've got a public sector labor force that's probably okay in size, but is being paid too much relative to productivity. And I think that's the returns you're looking for, is, are we getting our bang for a buck? And the answer is probably no. But that's not because the wages are too high, it's because the returns you're getting in terms of productivity are too low, and that's across all social services. Now, that's not to finger point every single public service worker, but I think certainly in education, in housing, and in other areas of public sector provisioning, that would be true. And I think that's also true for areas within the state-owned enterprise environment, right? Where you had underskilled individuals during the state capture year being paid massive, state capture years being paid massive amounts and essentially not being suited for the job. And that's the kind of wastage that you're concerned about. There's that. And then in the macro sense, you've got a public sector wage bill that's just gone out of control, to be honest. And I think the Treasury's, that's probably Treasury's biggest challenge in terms of deficit reduction. It's not about, it is about state-owned enterprises. I mean, they've had ROE, a return on equity, that's been negative for the last 5 years. So there are problems there. But as a budgetary concern outside of Eskom, they're not as big as the wage bill. Public sector wage bill is where the rubber hits the road. And I think if you wanted, I mean, you did ask earlier about the debt and debt projections. I think the Achilles heel of the MTF framework, so the debt projections going forward, is the assumption that the public sector wage bill will be settled at 4.5%. I don't see that happening. And I've written about this. So I'm worried that that's where we miss our deficit targets, or we cede on the public sector wage bill, and then effectively we resolve it through higher levels of revenue, for example, right, that we didn't expect.
So I just want to pivot now towards a follow-up on what Pieter was speaking about in relation to the global economy's impact on South Africa. Now, given the pivotal role of AGOA in boosting South Africa's exports across key sectors like the automotive industry and the agricultural industry, Pieter, how could South Africa navigate geopolitical challenges, especially its ties with countries like Russia and China, which impacts the ultimate renewal of AGOA? And moreover, in your view, what are the potential economic consequences beyond the immediate tariff impacts, particularly concerning investment confidence and market stability?
Yes, so in general, I have written about AGOA. I do find international trade agreements and any of this integration stuff, it's extremely interesting. Let me start from that side. Is firstly, AGOA is important because we as South Africa need everything we can to export and grow the economy. The US, I think, is our third largest trading partner. But I think in the end, the amount of our trade that actually goes through AGOA isn't massive. It's not like 80% of our trade with the US. I think it's like 25. I'm speaking under correction. I can't remember the number, but I was actually surprised that I thought more of South Africa's trade goes through it. And South Africa needs to export to balance our current accounts. So don't get me wrong, we need this. And especially with the US and the Western in general, the big economies, some of the investments are linked to this, even if it's not directly, it's implicitly, but knowing that if we lose our AGOA status, there must be other determinants and reasons why not to go and invest in South Africa. But when it comes to this whole dichotomy between choosing between the East and the West and going towards Russia or China or going towards the US, I do think it's almost a false dichotomy. I don't see why we need to choose. Why does South Africa need to choose between the two? We can trade with both. We can work with both sides of this. This is our government trying to put ourselves in more of the BRICS. And again, BRICS can have benefits. It could be a discussion for a different time or later. But choosing to go with Russia and China and India and trade more with these partners doesn't mean we should trade or work less with the West. We don't have to punch above our weight in this. This is, at the moment, global powers. and we are, I think, in the 30th or 40th largest economy, if not worse than that. It's not to our benefit. We won't benefit from alienating some of our largest trading partners for potential benefits from the other. We can play the middle ground. I think like Brazil does it extremely well as well. Brazil also suffers from that whole deindustrialization problem, don't get me wrong, but that is my massive takeaway is I do think that governments and our trade policy should put South Africa first and not ideology or what we think would be these powers want us to do with the other powers. It's put South African trade first. And in general, we need more investments. And again, this touches on everything that's been spoken to. We need to be more stable than we were over the past 10, 15 years and during the Zuma administration, because this will lead to international inflows of investments, which will help our industries, which will help our country. And this is the type of stance we need to take.
And with a quick follow-up to that, Pieter, so we noticed, especially with the run-up towards the US elections, even with us at the foundation doing, some research and analysis on the effects of the US elections on South Africa. At the time we were working on this, publishing our article on this, Kamala Harris wasn't yet, endorsed to run for the Democrats. And so we mainly focused our article on a Trump victory. But now we're at a place where there is potentially the ability for the Republicans and or the Democrats to take the presidency. Now, with this in mind, how do you think the upcoming US elections will impact us here in South Africa, whether it be the Republicans on one hand or the Democrats?
There is a lot of uncertainty because there's so many avenues this can go through. This can go through a GOA or direct processes with South Africa. But I do think whatever impact it's going to be, it's probably going to be secondary effects in terms of how the US treats the rest of the world. For instance, the Trump presidency, we'd expect more trade wars with China and them being pitted against each other. And in the end, increased trade uncertainty and just global supply chain problems increase prices for everyone and make things worse for everyone. So that is the type of thing, like it wouldn't impact South Africa, let's say, more than any other country. That's exactly in our point of view. Again, unless we're specifically targeted by Trump or the Democrats, I don't know at any point what they'll decide though. But the largest thing is increased global trade and a normalizing world order would be the best for South Africa, because that's like it's a very more calming ocean, and governments are more likely to take risks away from their shores and then go to more, not volatile, but more uncertain economies. Not as volatile as, let's say, Somalia and Niger and so forth, but you'll be able to invest in more emerging market economies. Whereas if there's a lot of uncertainty or tariffs or restrictions, then money is typically kept in safer havens within the developed economies, which doesn't bode well for us. This is my general takeaway. How would each presidency impact just global tensions?
I mean, the other thing, sorry, just to come in, I mean, even when you think of whether you're talking triple BEE or even AGOA, I mean, you do have to look at the substance of what we lose and what we potentially lose and what we could gain. So the substantive point is that firstly, differentiate between AGOA-related trade and trade with the US. They're different baskets, right? And trade with the US is about critical minerals, essentially. So the US has more to lose, right? If they break ties with us or whatever the case may be. And then on the AGOA side, some of the modeling work shows that the loss to GDP is actually very minor. Most of, so like our motor industry exports have pivoted away from the US towards the US, away from the US towards Europe. The other thing to keep in mind is we are non-aligned, right? So it's very important to remember, yes, we had the Russian ship sailing in. We weren't selling arms, so we're not a player in a serious global scale that we have to pick a side. And we don't pick sides. I mean, the substance of what we do is we keep it okay with everybody, right? And I think that's known to the US. And of course, we have our independent views, right, on key international matters. And that's respected by the US, but we are not meddling. We are not meddling seriously in any of US, let's call it so, US trade tensions with China, or China-Taiwan kind of tensions. South Africa's, far too small. I mean, let's not overstate our importance. Let's put it that way, right? I think the extent to which we put our heads down and do trade with as many partners as we can through AGOA and other forms is exactly the kind of focus you need, rather than worrying about Russian ships, which I think were overstated in retrospect.
No, absolutely. I'm so happy you touched on that, Prof. and Peter, because I think when we all saw 2 weeks ago Minister Park Stowe going to Washington, D.C. to try and get AGOA renegotiated, there was a little bit of concern that perhaps because of our support for Palestine, or perhaps because of our closeness to Russia or China, that might be put at risk. But I'm glad you've clarified that. Prof, I'd be remiss if I did not touch on this question. It's a very pertinent question. Peter, I'd like your view on this as well. And that's the national minimum wage. Now, the national minimum wage must balance both the needs of workers and the economic realities faced by businesses. So, Prof, how do you assess the recent adjustments to the national minimum wage? It now stands, I believe, at 27 Rand 58 an hour, and we see that it's open for comment for potential changes in 2025. What are some things that should be borne in mind, and what are your perspectives on that?
Yeah, so again, the short-term results have shown very little effects, negative effects on employment and wages from the national minimum wage. So to keep in mind, there's a rampant violation of the law, right? So in other words, the muted effect on and the muted economic effects from the national minimum wage will simply be because employers are not paying the national minimum wage, right? They're violating the law, and the last data exercise we did show about absolute violation levels of about 45%, right? On average. So 45% of employers are actually not paying workers the national minimum wage or the minimum wage. The thing I worry about is the cumulative effect of ratcheting up real minimum wage increases. So that's where things get worrying, and they start showing in longer run studies. And we're busy doing that at the moment. So the study should be released, I think, early next year, where you cumulatively assess the impact of these annual adjustments to the national minimum wage. And of course, also bringing up, remember, domestic and farm workers up to the national. So that's been a sub goal of the National Minimum Wage Commission. The cumulative effects is what one needs to keep an eye on. And I think that may be a more interesting set of results than the short-term effect, where because you've had COVID, a whole lot of other effects going on, it's hard to disentangle the pure minimum wage effect.
Peter, any thoughts from your side?
So yeah, in general, I'm not a labor market economist, so I would only be repeating a lot of just macroeconomic rhetoric. My main thing still is with reforms of labor markets. I can't speak to minimum wage, but what I can say is there is a big problem with just labor market rigidity and how we need to loosen regulations in terms of employers being able to fire bad apples. And because the current system, it's of that nature where employers won't risk hiring new people because they know as soon as they get them on board, it's extremely difficult to get rid of them. I know if we've looked at some of the data and some, even from our studies, continue to look at youth unemployment. And if you look at two youths that have the same university degree, but the one got 1 year's worth of work and the other one doesn't, it's completely different. As soon as you have some work experience, you tend to get a lot more other work experience. But by the nature of new employees or potential employees or people that don't have any experience, companies don't want to take a chance with them. So this is the type of reforms that I would reiterate. But I can't, unfortunately, speak directly to the minimum wage as is.
Oh,
I mean, so on the labor regulatory environment, I mean, just to pick up on that, the key piece of legislation that you most likely to get some movement on, right? So hiring and firing is really hard, and it's the CCMA efficiency that may be an issue rather than the regulation. It's the one that you may get some movement on is the extension to non-parties. And so that's bargaining council agreements that are signed off by representative parties, so large employers and large unions, but then are extended to non-parties. And for that, read small businesses, right? And so part of what the president tried to do with the red tape reduction, but I think that stalled under OV, Operation Vulindlela, was to remove the red tape around small businesses and so on. But the one sticking point still is that extension to non-parties, which sits in the LRA. And I think there, if you see some movement, you free up small businesses actually from being forced to adhere to centrally bargained wages and conditions of employment, which are essentially for large employers.
Pieter, you've recently written a very interesting analysis. I've picked it up on Politics Web, and it's called that GNU optimism is a placebo against the economic realities of our time. And essentially, you touch on how there's a prevailing sense of optimism about potential economic improvements, but that actually the economic indicators that we're seeing prove otherwise. I want to ask you a simple question to end off, Pieter and Professor Bhorat, from your respective perspectives. Do you think that with a government of national unity, we're headed on the right track? What do you think should change if we're not?
Okay, I'll start. I do think we are definitely better off than we were a year ago, and we are moving towards the right track. That article mostly focuses on that we don't have ample evidence, firstly, at the moment. I know there hasn't been a lot of indicators and so forth, so it was a couple that I looked at. My main qualm is that a lot of the time South Africans are optimists by nature, and we like to believe the optimistic narrative, but we need to remain critical lest we forget the past. Every time the government announces something is going to happen or improve and then it doesn't happen, we just write the next story when the government promises this time we will really do it. But I am in general more optimistic about this government. I will absolutely give it to President Ramaphosa in terms of being to navigate the ANC dropping below 50 and coming close to 40, being able to hold his power and guide us into the era of coalition politics. I do hope that this results in increased ideas being brought out in policy and not just a reduction of opposition voices.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, so the way to think about the GNU is the political settlement we needed, right? To bring the constitutionalists under one roof, right? And I think that's positive. That's positive all around because the economic policy regime makes sense. The country's not being run by the crazies, right? So and I think that's really important. So macro stability is not even a question. It's not even an issue, right? In the current government because it's a GNU, right? It's not the hard left where populist monetary policy starts suddenly becoming a real option, and the Venezuela route sort of starts opening up. So I think that's been dispensed with. But I think where the GNU can, by its very nature, deliver will be operationally, right? So you'll see an increased, I think, focus on using state resources better and so on. And I think there will be a demonstration effect, right, from the new ministers and the sort of older ministers following suit, right? So that's natural. I think the real challenge, though, still remains whether, even as a GNU, you can make those big structural shifts. So the idea of moving away from consumption expenditure towards investment expenditure as a government, the idea of thinking about firms and supply side mechanisms for firms rather than looking at households only. So the way you resolve poverty and unemployment is not only by giving social assistance, but actually by supporting firms, including the informal sector and upwards. And I think that's a policy shift. That's almost independent of whether you have a GNU or not. And I think that challenge is still open. And that takes a little bit more work and time for government to turn around. But one day at a time, and I think we're moving in the right direction. Yeah.
Well, we all certainly hope that we are. Thank you so much, Professor Haroon Bhorat, Pieter Scribante. That was another episode of the Constitution at Work podcast brought to you by the F.W. de Klerk Foundation. We had with us Professor Haroon Bhorat, Director of the Development Policy Research Unit at the University of Cape Town, and Pieter Scribante, Senior Political Economist at Oxford Economics Africa. Thank you both.